February 20th, 1945. Dawn broke over Iwo Jima like a wound opening in the sky. The black volcanic sand beneath Corporal James Hartley's boots still shook from the naval bombardment that had torn through the night. Smoke rose from 1,000 craters, twisting upward in grey columns that merged with the low clouds hanging over the island. Hartley crouched behind a shattered landing craft, watching something he'd never seen before roll past his position. The M4A3R3 Sherman moved slowly across the beach, its hull painted the same olive drab as any other tank, except for the long, skeletal arm extending from its turret. At the end of that arm, a nozzle. Inside the tank, 290 gallons of napalm. Hartley didn't know it yet, but he was watching the weapon that would rewrite the rules of this battle. Ahead of them, buried beneath tons of volcanic rock and concrete, 10,000 Japanese soldiers waited in silence. They had tunnels. They had time. They had orders to kill 10 Americans each before dying themselves. But they didn't know what was coming for them. By early 1945, the war in the Pacific had become a war of mathematics. American strategists traced lines on maps between the Mariana Islands and Tokyo, 1,500 miles of open ocean. Along those lines, B-29 superfortresses flew through darkness, carrying incendiary bombs that would turn Japanese cities into ash. But the mathematics were brutal. Planes damaged over Japan by anti-aircraft fire or mechanical failure faced an impossible choice: ditch in the freezing Pacific or try to limp home on failing engines. Most didn't make it. By January, more B-29s were being destroyed on runways in the Marianas by Japanese raiders than were being shot down over Japan itself. Those raiders came from a tiny speck of volcanic rock halfway between Saipan and Tokyo. The island measured 8 square miles. Its name was Iwo Jima, and it was killing the American bombing campaign. The Japanese garrison on Iwo Jima operated radar stations that detected every bomber formation heading north. Early warnings gave Tokyo's air defenses hours to prepare. Searchlights positioned, anti-aircraft crews alerted, interceptors scrambled. The element of surprise, crucial to minimizing losses, vanished the moment American bombers crossed Iwo Jima's radar range. Worse, Japanese fighters based on the island's 2 airfields flew harassment missions against the Marianas, striking B-29s on the ground when they were most vulnerable, loaded with fuel and ammunition, unable to maneuver. For such a small island, Iwo Jima held disproportionate power. It stood like a watchtower in the middle of America's critical supply line, and as long as it remained in Japanese hands, every mission to Tokyo carried the weight of that surveillance. American military planners identified 3 objectives for Operation Detachment, the code name for Iwo Jima's invasion. First, eliminate the early warning radar that stripped American bombers of tactical surprise. Second, destroy the airfields that allowed Japanese interceptors to harass the Marianas. Third, and most critical, transform Iwo Jima into an emergency landing strip and refueling station for damaged B-29s. The island sat precisely halfway along the Tokyo run, the perfect safe haven for crippled bombers that couldn't complete the journey home. Additionally, capturing Iwo Jima would provide a base for P-51 Mustang fighter escorts, protecting the bombers during their most vulnerable moments over Japanese cities. The plan also served another purpose: protecting the right flank for the upcoming invasion of Okinawa, scheduled for April. Every objective pointed to the same conclusion: Iwo Jima had to be taken. But there was something else. Something that went beyond strategic calculations. Iwo Jima was not just another Pacific island captured by Japan during its expansion. It was considered part of the Tokyo Prefecture, administered as Japanese sovereign territory for centuries. When American forces landed on that black sand, they would be stepping onto Japanese home soil for the first time in nearly 2,000 years. The psychological impact of this fact reverberated through both militaries. For Americans, it represented the beginning of the final phase, the march toward Tokyo itself. For the Japanese, it meant something far more visceral. The sacred homeland was about to be invaded. That reality shaped everything about how the battle would be fought. The man responsible for defending Iwo Jima arrived on June 19, 1944. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi stepped off a transport plane onto Chidori Airfield and immediately understood what his garrison was doing wrong. His soldiers were digging trenches on the beaches, the traditional Japanese defensive posture designed to meet the enemy at the waterline with overwhelming force and then finish them with a Banzai charge. Kuribayashi had studied American tactics throughout the Pacific. He knew beach defenses didn't work anymore. American naval bombardment and close air support could obliterate any position within sight of the ocean. He ordered the trenches abandoned. Instead, he told his men something that shocked them. When the Marines land, let them come ashore unopposed. Kuribayashi's plan represented a complete rejection of Japanese military doctrine. There would be no honorable death charges, no suicidal attacks into machine gun fire, no dramatic last stands on the beaches. He explicitly forbade Banzai charges, calling them suicide without purpose. Every soldier under his command received a single order: kill 10 Americans before you die. Not in a glorious charge, but through calculated attrition from fortified positions. The goal was not victory. Kuribayashi understood that was impossible against American industrial might, but delay. Every day Iwo Jima held out was another day Japanese civilians on the home islands were spared from B-29 incendiary raids. His strategy was built on a simple premise: fight from positions the Americans couldn't see and couldn't destroy. He transformed Iwo Jima into an underground fortress. Engineers arrived from Japan with detailed blueprints for a tunnel network that would span 11 miles beneath the volcanic rock. The tunnels connected 5,000 caves each, reinforced with concrete, made from the island's black volcanic ash, mixed with cement. A combination that proved superior to standard materials, creating walls 4 feet thick, capable of withstanding direct naval shell hits. Pillboxes and bunkers were positioned for interlocking fields of fire, ensuring that any Marine who destroyed one position would immediately come under fire from 2 others. The Japanese installed gasoline-powered generators to provide electricity for lighting and radio communication deep underground. They stockpiled food for 2.5 months, water in 555-gallon drums, ammunition for every weapon system. Kuribayashi turned Mount Suribachi into a semi-independent fortress, honeycombed with artillery positions and observation posts. In the island's northern highlands, he created a main defensive line anchored by Colonel Nishi's tank battalion. 22 Type 97 tanks dug into the ground up to their turrets, transformed into immobile artillery bunkers covered with camouflage. By February 1945, 21,000 Japanese soldiers lived inside Iwo Jima, not on it. When American reconnaissance flights photographed the island, they saw relatively few defensive positions. Intelligence officers believed the preliminary naval bombardment, scheduled for 3 days before the invasion, would be sufficient. They were catastrophically wrong. On the morning of February 19, 1945, 30,000 Marines of the 4th and 5th Divisions landed on Iwo Jima's southeastern beaches. For the first hour, they encountered almost no resistance. The black volcanic sand made movement difficult. It shifted beneath boots and vehicle treads like water, offering no purchase, but there was no incoming fire. Marines pushed inland 500 meters. Equipment poured onto the beaches. Landing craft packed shoulder to shoulder along the waterline, unloading ammunition, supplies, and reinforcements. Then Kuribayashi's trap closed. Every artillery piece, mortar and machine gun that had remained silent for an hour opened fire simultaneously. The beaches became a killing ground. Marines couldn't dig foxholes in the volcanic ash for cover. Shells fell in precise patterns, pre-registered during months of preparation. The Americans had walked into a perfectly designed ambush, and the weapons they had relied on throughout the Pacific, naval gunfire, airstrikes, and tank support, couldn't reach an enemy they couldn't see. The flamethrower tanks arrived on February 20th, the second day of the battle. 8 M4A3R3 Sherman tanks designated as Zippos rolled off landing craft and moved toward the first Japanese strongpoint identified by Marine infantry, a concrete pillbox built into the base of Mount Suribachi. Traditional Sherman tanks had already attempted to neutralize the position with 75mm high-explosive rounds. The shells cratered the ground around the pillbox, but left the 4-foot-thick volcanic concrete walls untouched. Rifle companies tried to advance past the position and were cut down by interlocking machine gun fire from positions the infantry couldn't locate. Engineers attempted demolition charges, but Japanese snipers killed 3 men before they reached the pillbox entrance. Then Sergeant Robert Thompson's flame tank moved forward. The M4A3R3 carried a Navy Mark I flamethrower mounted in the bow, replacing the standard hull machine. Inside the tank, 290 gallons of napalm, a mixture of gasoline thickened with aluminum salts, sat in pressurized tanks. The system could project flame 150 yards, 3 times the range of a man-portable flamethrower. Thompson positioned his tank 75 yards from the pillbox, well beyond the effective range of Japanese small arms fire, and activated the weapon. A stream of burning napalm arced through the air and poured through the pillbox, firing slit like liquid fire. The napalm didn't just burn, it consumed oxygen. Inside the concrete bunker, Japanese soldiers suffocated before the flames reached them. 15 seconds later, the firing from the pillbox stopped. Marines who had been pinned down for 4 hours advanced past the position. They didn't know it yet, but they had just witnessed the tactical solution to Kuribayashi's fortress. The psychological impact on Japanese defenders was immediate and profound. Soldiers who had been trained to fight to the death, who had accepted that they would kill 10 Americans before dying, now faced a weapon that turned their underground fortress into a death trap. Tunnels that provided protection from naval shells and aerial bombs became conduits for flame. Napalm flowed through tunnel openings, following the paths of least resistance, spreading through the networks that had taken months to construct. Cave entrances that offered shelter became oven doors. Japanese soldiers who survived the initial flame attacks reported that the heat turned concrete walls too hot to touch, that the smoke and fumes filled chambers so completely that men collapsed within seconds. Traditional defensive tactics, taking cover, waiting for the enemy to expose themselves, firing from concealed positions, became worthless against an enemy who didn't need to see you to kill you. Within the first week of the battle, flame tank tactics evolved into a systematic assault pattern. Marine infantry identified a Japanese defensive position, usually by receiving fire from it. The infantry pulled back and marked the location with smoke grenades. Flame tanks moved forward under covering fire from standard Shermans, approached to within optimal range, typically 75 to 100 yards, and saturated the position with napalm. Each burst lasted 10 to 15 seconds and consumed 20 to 30 gallons of fuel. If the position continued firing after the first burst, the tank operator adjusted angle and distance and fired again. Most positions went silent after the second burst. Marine infantry then advanced with demolition charges to seal cave entrances and tunnel openings, preventing Japanese soldiers from reoccupying cleared positions, one of Kuribayashi's key defensive strategies. The combination of flame saturation and immediate demolition broke the tunnel network's greatest advantage, its interconnectedness. The 8 flame tanks operated across the island simultaneously, supporting different Marine regiments as they pushed north from the landing beaches toward the island's interior. Captain Gordon Caldwell, commanding a company of flame tanks, reported that his vehicles averaged 12 to 15 engagements per day during the first 2 weeks of the battle. Each tank carried enough napalm for approximately 10 bursts before requiring resupply. Daily consumption of napalm reached 10,000 gallons across all flame tank operations, not including man-portable flamethrower units. Supply ships brought bulk napalm to Iwo Jima in 55-gallon drums, which were then transported to forward refueling positions behind Marine lines. The logistics of flame warfare, moving thousands of gallons of pressurized, highly flammable fuel across an active battlefield, created challenges that combat engineers solved through trial and error, often under incoming artillery fire. The assault on Mount Suribachi demonstrated the evolution of flame warfare into coordinated combined arms tactics. The 556-foot volcanic peak dominated the southern end of Iwo Jima, and Kuribayashi had transformed it into a fortress within a fortress. 70 pillboxes and bunkers connected by tunnels, with artillery observation posts that could direct fire across the entire landing beach. Marine infantry began the assault on February 21st, but progress measured in yards cost dozens of casualties. Japanese defenders waited until Marine squads reached point-blank range before opening fire from hidden positions. Standard tactics, suppressive fire, infantry advance, grenade assault, failed against an enemy who could retreat into tunnels, relocate through underground passages, and reappear behind cleared positions. On February 23rd, flame tanks reached the base of Suribachi. Over the next 48 hours, they systematically attacked every cave entrance and pillbox on the mountain's slopes, pouring napalm into openings that infantry had marked with colored smoke. The volcanic rock amplified the heat, turning cave complexes into ovens. By the afternoon of February 23rd, Marines reached Suribachi's summit and raised an American flag, the moment captured in Joe Rosenthal's iconic photograph. But the image that would define American resolve came at the cost of a tactical revolution happening below. Flame had broken what conventional weapons could not. The northern highlands presented a different challenge entirely. Marines called it the meat grinder, a complex of 3 fortified positions designated Hill 382, Turkey Knob, and the Amphitheater. Kuribayashi had concentrated his strongest defenses here, including Colonel Takechi Nishi's tank battalion, artillery batteries protected by concrete casemates, and the most extensive tunnel network on the island. American commanders estimated it would take 3 days to secure the meat grinder. It took 10 days of continuous assault. Flame tanks operated in teams of 2 or 3, supported by standard Shermans providing covering fire and Marine infantry securing flanks. The terrain channeled attacks into narrow approaches that Japanese artillery crews had pre-registered, turning every advance into a gauntlet. Flame tank crews developed a technique they called cooking, sustained bursts of napalm that turned bunker interiors into infernos hot enough to detonate stored ammunition. When a position exploded from secondary detonations, Marines knew the napalm had reached the ammunition stores. Japanese defenders attempted desperate countermeasures: magnetic mines attached to poles, thrust against tank hulls by soldiers who emerged from spider holes, satchel charges thrown from concealed positions, even kamikaze attacks by individual soldiers carrying demolition charges. Few succeeded. The flame tank's armor proved resistant to everything except direct artillery hits, and Marine infantry protecting the flanks intercepted most suicide attackers before they reached the vehicles. Japanese defenders faced an impossible tactical dilemma. Kuribayashi's strategy depended on interconnected defensive positions. If one fell, others would provide supporting fire, while defenders retreated through tunnels to regroup. Flame warfare broke that system. When napalm filled a tunnel complex, defenders couldn't retreat. They could only stay and suffocate or emerge into Marine gunfire. Positions that should have held for days fell in hours. The psychological effect compounded the tactical crisis. Japanese soldiers who survived flame attacks reported uncontrollable terror at the weapon's approach. The sound of the Zippo's engine, the sight of the flame projector swiveling toward their position, the knowledge that there was no defense against what was coming, it broke the discipline that had sustained defenders through weeks of bombardment. Some Japanese units violated Kuribayashi's explicit orders and launched small-scale Banzai charges rather than wait for the flames. These attacks were suicidal and tactically worthless, exactly what Kuribayashi had forbidden, but they reflected the desperation flame warfare created. American after-action reports documented increasing frequency of these charges during the second and third weeks of the battle, particularly at night, when flame tanks couldn't operate effectively due to visibility limitations. By early March, Marine forces controlled 2/3 of Iwo Jima, and flame tanks had become the primary assault weapon for reducing fortified positions. Daily napalm consumption remained at 10,000 gallons. Supply chains adapted to the demand. Ships arrived with bulk napalm stored in portable tanks that could be transferred directly to forward supply dumps. Combat engineers established refueling stations within 1,000 yards of the front lines, accepting the risk of catastrophic explosion if Japanese artillery found the fuel dumps. They never did, either through extraordinary luck or because Kuribayashi's remaining artillery was too depleted to conduct effective counter-battery fire. The 8 original Zippos operated continuously, with maintenance crews performing repairs overnight to ensure maximum availability during daylight hours. Mechanical failures were inevitable. Flame projector mechanisms clogged with residue, pressure systems developed leaks, engines strained under continuous operation. But Marine mechanics kept 6 to 7 tanks operational throughout March. The few that went offline for extended repairs were immediately replaced by standard Shermans retrofitted with flame equipment, maintaining consistent flame capability across all regimental sectors. The Japanese defenders, trapped in shrinking pockets of resistance, faced an enemy they could not stop and a weapon that transformed their fortress into a tomb. General Kuribayashi sent his final message to Tokyo on March 17, 1945. The transmission was brief. The battle is entering its final chapter. Since the enemy's landing, even the gods would weep at the bravery of the officers and men under my command. He did not mention surrender. There was no surrender. By March 21st, organized Japanese resistance had collapsed into isolated pockets scattered across Iwo Jima's northern tip. American commanders declared the island officially secure on March 26th, but fighting continued. Small groups of Japanese soldiers, some as few as 3 or 4 men, others numbering dozens, remained hidden in caves and tunnels that had survived the flame assaults. They emerged at night to conduct raids against Marine positions, scavenging for food, water, and ammunition. Some held out for weeks. The last confirmed Japanese holdout on Iwo Jima surrendered in January 1949, nearly 4 years after the battle ended. But for the Marines who fought there, the battle ended when the count was made and the numbers became real. The casualty figures stunned American military planners. Of the 70,000 Marines who landed on Iwo Jima, 26,000 became casualties, a 37% casualty rate. Nearly 7,000 died. The ratio of American to Japanese casualties, 3 Americans wounded or killed for every 2 Japanese, was unprecedented in Pacific warfare. Previous island battles had seen Japanese casualty rates 3 to 5 times higher than American losses. Iwo Jima inverted that calculus. Of the 21,000 Japanese soldiers defending the island, only 216 were captured alive, and most of those had been knocked unconscious by explosions or were too severely wounded to commit suicide. The rest died. Estimates suggested that as many as 3,000 Japanese soldiers continued fighting in the tunnel networks even after the island was declared secure, gradually succumbing to wounds, starvation, or suicide rather than surrender. The battle consumed everything: men, materiel, time, hope. Admiral Chester Nimitz described Iwo Jima as the place where uncommon valor was a common virtue. He didn't mention the cost of that valor, but everyone who served there understood. The role of flamethrowers in achieving that brutal victory became clear during post-battle assessments. Marine Corps combat reports estimated that flame weapons, both tank-mounted and man-portable, accounted for over 30% of confirmed Japanese casualties. Given that the total Japanese death toll reached approximately 20,000, that meant flamethrowers killed or incapacitated more than 6,000 enemy soldiers. Captain Gordon Caldwell, who commanded the 3rd Armored Flame Platoon, reported that his 8 tanks participated in over 400 separate engagements during the 36-day battle, consuming more than 360,000 gallons of napalm. Every major Japanese defensive position, Mount Suribachi, the Meat Grinder, Hill 362A, Turkey Knob, fell only after sustained flame attacks. Positions that conventional weapons had pounded for days with negligible effect succumbed to flame in hours. The statistics told a story of tactical transformation. Flame warfare had turned Kuribayashi's fortress strategy against itself. Japanese military analysts studying the battle from Tokyo reached similar conclusions. Intelligence reports captured after the war revealed that Japanese commanders viewed the American flame tactics as the decisive factor in Iwo Jima's fall. One report, written by a staff officer who had survived the Battle of Saipan and observed Iwo Jima's defense from a distance, stated, "The underground fortress, which should have been impregnable, became a death trap. The weapon that burns oxygen proved more effective than any explosive. Our soldiers faced not merely death, but incineration alive. No training prepares men for such weapons." The report recommended fundamental changes to Japanese defensive doctrine, suggesting that future island defenses should avoid deep tunnel networks in favor of dispersed surface positions that flame weapons could not effectively target. Those recommendations came too late. Okinawa would be the next battle, and Kuribayashi's tactics would be attempted again, with full knowledge that flame could break them. The strategic justification for Iwo Jima's cost arrived on March 4, 1945, before the battle had even ended. A B-29 superfortress named Dynamite, crippled by Japanese anti-aircraft fire over Tokyo and losing fuel from ruptured tanks, diverted from its course toward the Marianas and made an emergency landing on Iwo Jima's partially completed airstrip. Marine engineers had worked under Japanese artillery fire to extend the runway enough for heavy bombers, prioritizing that construction over almost everything else. Dynamite touched down with less than 5 minutes of fuel remaining. 11 men who would have died in the Pacific survived because Iwo Jima existed as American territory. It was the first of 2,400 emergency landings that would occur on Iwo Jima before the war ended in August. Simple mathematics suggested those landings saved 27,000 American aircrew lives, roughly matching the total Marine casualties suffered taking the island. The cost-benefit analysis was brutal and exact, but it provided the justification military planners needed when they faced questions about whether Iwo Jima had been worth the price. Beyond emergency landings, Iwo Jima transformed the strategic bombing campaign against Japan. P-51 Mustang fighters deployed to the island in March, providing escort coverage for B-29 formations attacking Japanese cities. The fighters extended bomber survivability dramatically. Losses to Japanese interceptors dropped by more than 40% once escorts became routine. The psychological impact on bomber crews was equally significant. Knowing that Iwo Jima sat halfway along their route, that they could divert there if damaged, that fighter protection would meet them over the target, it changed how crews approached missions. The early warning radar that had alerted Tokyo to every bomber formation was gone, replaced by American radar that tracked Japanese interceptors and provided advance warning to incoming bombers. The B-29 campaign intensified through spring and summer 1945, culminating in the firebombing raids that devastated Japanese industrial capacity and urban centers. Iwo Jima didn't guarantee victory, but it made victory more efficient and less costly in American lives. The tactical lessons learned on Iwo Jima shaped American planning for Operation Downfall, the proposed invasion of mainland Japan, scheduled for November 1945. Flame warfare became a central component of assault doctrine. The Marine Corps and Army expanded flame tank units, ordering additional M4A3R3 Shermans and developing improved flame systems with greater range and fuel capacity. Training programs emphasized combined arms tactics, infantry, tanks, flame tanks, and engineers working in coordinated assault teams to reduce fortified positions. Intelligence estimates for Japanese defenses on Kyushu and Honshu suggested tunnel networks and underground fortifications far more extensive than anything encountered on Iwo Jima. American planners assumed they would need flame capabilities on a scale 10 times larger than deployed in any previous battle. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August rendered those plans unnecessary. But the assumption remained. If mainland Japan had to be taken by force, flame would be the weapon that made it possible. Japanese military leaders drew their own conclusions from Iwo Jima's fall. Documents captured after Japan's surrender revealed intense debate within Imperial General Headquarters about defensive strategy. Some officers argued that Kuribayashi's tactics had been fundamentally sound. He had inflicted unprecedented casualties and delayed American progress for 36 days with no hope of reinforcement or resupply. Others contended that the tunnel network had become a liability once flame warfare proved effective, that future defenses should emphasize mobility and dispersed positions rather than static fortifications. The debate became academic when Japan surrendered in August, but it reflected a broader recognition. American industrial capacity had produced not just more weapons, but different weapons that rendered traditional defensive tactics obsolete. The flamethrower represented something beyond conventional military power. It was warfare that attacked not just positions or soldiers, but the very possibility of defense itself. For an empire built on martial honor and the belief that spirit could overcome material disadvantage, that recognition was perhaps the most devastating casualty of all. The black sand of Iwo Jima holds 28,000 graves, 6,000 American, 22,000 Japanese. The mathematics of the battle are precise and merciless. Nearly 700 Americans died for every square mile of volcanic rock. One Marine or Navy corpsman became a casualty for every 3 who landed. The only battle in the Pacific where American casualties exceeded Japanese deaths, though Japanese combat fatalities numbered 3 times American killed in action. Numbers that defined a new calculus of modern warfare. Not victory or defeat, but degrees of acceptable loss measured against strategic necessity. The flamethrower's role in that equation extends beyond tactical innovation. It represents a threshold moment when warfare moved past the question of whether technology should be developed and deployed, and entered an era where capability determined use. If a weapon could shorten a battle, save lives on one side by taking lives more efficiently on the other, reduce the duration of suffering through increased intensity, then ethical considerations became secondary to practical outcomes. The flame tactics that broke Kuribayashi's fortress saved thousands of American lives by killing thousands of Japanese soldiers in ways that traditional weapons could not. That calculation justified the means through the ends, a logic that would be applied again at Hiroshima and Nagasaki 4 months later, and in countless conflicts since. For the men who fought on Iwo Jima, the legacy is simpler and more enduring. They survived something that should have been unsurvivable. They watched friends die for yards of volcanic ash that held no intrinsic value beyond its position on a map. They learned that courage and terror are not opposites, but companions, that honor exists in actions taken despite overwhelming fear, that survival carries its own weight of memory. Joe Rosenthal's photograph of the flag raising on Mount Suribachi became iconic not because it showed victory, but because it captured a moment of human determination, men struggling against wind and gravity to raise a symbol while the battle raged around them. The image promised meaning in sacrifice, purpose in loss. Whether that promise was kept depends on who you ask and what they carry from that black sand beach. Iwo Jima demonstrated that fortresses can be broken, that no defense is absolute when matched against sufficient will and industrial capacity. But it also revealed that breaking fortresses comes at a cost measured in young men who will never grow old, in families that receive telegrams instead of homecomings, in questions about necessity and sacrifice that have no satisfying answers. The flamethrowers that turned Japanese tunnels into crematoriums saved marine lives. That is factually true. They also created a new category of warfare where incineration became an acceptable tactical choice. Both truths exist simultaneously, neither cancelling the other. Iwo Jima stands as testament to what humans will endure for strategic objectives, what weapons they will create to achieve those objectives, and what memories they will carry when the objectives are secured and the accounting begins. The island remains. The graves remain. The questions remain.